So in this session, we'll be talking about victim empowerment and transnational conflicts. The speakers for the day are Professor Sandra Walkley, Eleanor Rathbone Chair of Sociology, University of Liverpool, UK. Our second speaker is Mr. Levent Alton, Victim Support Europe. Our third speaker is Professor Dr. M. Priyamvada, Professor, Department of Criminology, University of Madras. The session will be moderated by Ms. Mehak Bajpai, Research Scholar, National Law University, Delhi. Ms. Mehak is Research Associate for Committee for Reforms in Criminal Law. She is a Research Scholar at NLU, Delhi. She completed her Masters in Criminal and Constitutional Law in 2018 from NLU, Delhi. Since then, she has worked on NHRC project with NLU, Delhi on the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, focusing on the impact statement, and also took up various teaching assignments. She has also authored and edited several articles in peer-reviewed journals, as well as mainstream newspapers. I welcome you all for this interactive session and request Ms. Mehak Bajpai to please coordinate and moderate the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm grateful for being a part of this colloquium today. So I will begin by introducing our panelists for this session. We have with us Professor Sandra Walkley. She is the current Eleanor Rathbone Chair of Sociology at the University of Liverpool, conjoined Professor of Criminology at the University of Monash, Melbourne, and the President of the British Society of Criminology. Her most recent work has extended interest in war through critical engagement with criminological understandings of war and its consequences through a gendered lens. Thank you so much, Professor Sandra, for joining us today. It is a privilege to have you here with us. We also have with us Mr. Levent Alton, who is the Executive Director at Victim Support Europe. He began his career in the UK Ministry of Justice before spending 3 years in the European Commission working on European criminal law. So I think following a 2-year stint leading a justice and a home affairs team in European consultancy, he returned to the victims world in 2014 as the executive director of Victim Support Europe, which is the leading European victim advocacy network. For the last few years, he has been leading the organization in its work to help establish and improve victims support services in Europe, develop better cross-border support services, establish training programs for practitioners, and develop new victims policies and advocate on behalf of all the victims. Additionally, he regularly lectures and provides presentations around the world on victims' rights, policies, and support mechanisms. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Levent. We're excited to have you in this session. We also have with us Professor M. Priyamvada, who is a professor at the University of Madras. She's also officiating as a General Secretary at the Indian Society of Victimology. She has successfully completed a major research project titled Fading Values in Forgotten Victims, a study on violence against elderly women in Chennai city, sponsored by the University Grants Commission, New Delhi. She's also authored a number of research papers in journals of national and international repute. So thank you so much for joining us here today, ma'am. Also, so though he is not in the panel of speakers today, we also have with us Mr. Yong-Woo Lee, who is the president and founder of Victim Support Asia. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Lee. So before we proceed, I'd just like to briefly explain the topic for this session. We're discussing victim empowerment and transnational conflicts today. This is an immensely important topic, especially in the times we're living right now. We see so many conflicts around us, and therefore it becomes important to discuss the impact of these transnational conflicts on vulnerable groups and others in these areas. So the issues we have flagged for this session are victimhood in peace and conflict studies, transitional justice, and understanding the complex legal frameworks in international criminal law. Recognizing the role and interests of victims is one of the most significant strides made by international criminal justice in the 21st century. So without further ado, let me invite our speakers for the day to the podium. I would first like to invite Professor Sandra to share her views on this meta issue of victim empowerment in transnational conflicts.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in your first colloquium. It must be a really exciting turning point in the development of victim studies, both locally and globally. It's a real privilege to be here. I've thought a fair bit about the questions that you thought would be useful for this session, and I just want to play devil's advocate a little bit, and rather than talk about what we might learn from peace and conflict studies about victimhood, but turn the question around and ask what peace and conflict studies might learn from victimology. It's a slightly different emphasis, but I think it's important to, in taking that starting point, to actually recognise that victimology's origins lie in peace and conflict studies. You know, Mendelssohn's work and several of the other founding fathers was very much preoccupied with the Second World War and its consequences. Mendelssohn himself, as work has demonstrated, was very much impacted by the Holocaust, and his later writings, in particular, he became very much concerned about a concept he called victimity, which was really the extent to which the powerful mass oppression resulted in certain populations being targeted. So he was trying to talk about the nature of victimhood in the context of war and its consequences, not in terms of victim innocence or victim blaming, but actually trying to understand the process. How do these things come about? Now, that's one version of victimology's history. The other version actually is also connected with war, and that is the First World War and the growth of what Didier Fassin and Richard Reckman have called psychiatric victimology, where in that context, the emergence of understanding the impact of trauma on particularly soldiers, which then stretched out into understanding trauma in the workplace, like the impact of industrial disasters and so on, produced a strand of victimology that they called psychiatric victimology, which was very much focused on the impact of awful events and on what that impact had on people and their subsequent lives and behaviour, and the extent to which they could cope with that. Now, what's interesting about victimology as a discipline is that the first version, Mendelssohn's version, is what contributed towards what Robert Peacock talked about on Sunday as positivist victimology, and kind of got swept into the whole notion of national victimisation surveys, measuring the nature of victimisation, looking at the impact of crime in a much more narrow field sense, you know, on victims. The second strand of victimology, the psychiatric strand, produced in 1983, post-traumatic stress disorder, designated by the International Psychiatric Association, and also borrowed by those concerned with the impact of rape. The early work in the 70s talked about the impact of rape as being post-traumatic stress. So my point about talking about these two stories, the victim story, the positivist victim story, and the trauma story, is to actually begin to understand how, by the time we get to the 21st century, they've become melded together. And I think that's a problem for victimology, actually, because in melding those stories together, we are experiencing something contemporarily called, that I've called trauma creep. So that when we become focused on secondary victimization, you know, so going to court's tough and nobody likes being asked hard questions, you know, you get the language of trauma being used to try and frame those experiences which actually does two things. It actually does a disservice to those victims who are traumatized in the post-traumatic stress notion of trauma, and actually pushes all victims into the same category, as though to be a victim is to be traumatized. So I think when we get to the 21st century and we're talking about peace and conflict studies, it's important to understand where those two trajectories of victimology have come from, and how as victimologists we can help fine-tune, better understand what this moment looks like. So then when we come to talk about, you know, what do we do? How do we empower victims in the aftermath of conflict? When you bring those two stories together, there are dangers in assuming that whatever initiative we put in place, whether that's the International Criminal Court, imbued as it is with neoliberal standards of law, or when we talk about transitional justice, we actually already know what impact these events have had on people, and we don't always. And I think that's a problem. And I've not done any work in the transitional justice, but I am aware of empirical work that's been done that actually demonstrates that what the transitional justice initiatives being introduced in particular locations think people want isn't actually what people want, in terms of being able to reconcile themselves, move on from what's happened to them. And I think that's a problem that comes from the way in which these two narratives have become mixed up, gelled together, and makes assumptions that we can universalize what experiences of conflict and war look like at a local level. So in a sense, that's also endorsing something that Robert Peacock said on Sunday about the importance of context. Understanding history, context, culture is really important for empowering victims in post-conflict situations. I've perhaps said enough. Maybe you want to ask some questions at this point.
Right. So, it's in the same lines of what you just said. Although we shouldn't discount or diminish anyone's experiences with violence or persecution, but the best way to help people or nations recover may also be in helping them shed this idea of victimhood and feel their agency, so that they can respond in a way that calms them rather than promotes this cycle of violence. So my question is that what are the ways we can do that? I mean, it's a wide question, but are there any studies on this, rehabilitation of people?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of it is a matter of perspective, and I agree with you. I think part of the problem of the trauma narrative, as it is expressed in policy discourse in particular, is that it does deny people agency. And I think if you actually start from a position that people actually are more resilient than we think and can cope, then that's a way of helping them recognize, yes, something's happened, awful has happened to them, but they do have some means within themselves or shared within their community to actually begin to rebuild. I mean, I think one of the people who's influenced my thinking around these sorts of things is the work of Veena Das, in particular, who's now based in the States, but is an anthropologist, I think, by training, and she talks very much about to be a victim doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't got coping skills and you haven't got a victim is a momentary thing. It isn't a lifelong thing, and I think that's important. Listening to people helps, though listening itself is a challenging concept. And I think part of what I'm saying is really who gets listened to, why they get listened to, and how that listening happens are really important. Researchers talk about, in the field of transitional justice, researchers talk about the presence of what was referred to as justice entrepreneurs. In other words, there are people nominated by perhaps international organisations, perhaps by the United Nations, perhaps by the European Community, who have a particular way of thinking about what counts as transitional justice, and they go out into context and apply that concept in settings that it's not always appropriate for. So I think we have to start to think a bit more critically about what some of these initiatives mean in the settings in which they're applied.
Yeah. Also, since you were talking about transitional justice, I'm not very well versed with this issue, but I have read that scholars often argue that this approach it often fails to adequately deal with the multidimensional issue of gender justice. So usually when a nation is in a state of transition, the gender issues are often put aside. And their advocates are told that they must wait until peace is secured before pushing for change. So this has been bugging me quite a bit. What are we doing to, to tackle this issue in transitional approach to justice? If
Absolutely.
you have any views on this,
yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. What we see going on in the world today is gendered, absolutely gendered, and whether it's in a war context where the victors celebrate their success. When we talk about victors, we're talking about men mostly. When we talk about the consequences of war, we know it's going on as we speak. The violence perpetrated against women and children is there for all to see. Has always been there. It's not unique to the 21st century. It's been a feature of war and its consequences for a long time. So when you come to transitional initiatives, failure to recognise who's paid the price and what that constituent group looks like, whether it's gender or whether it's religion in some contexts, or other features of, how can you say, of groups of people who don't fit the male norm. I think that's a real challenge for people working in this field, without doubt.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor. This was very insightful. Thank you for your comments. I would now like to invite Mr. Altman to the podium and share his views on these issues.
Thank you, Mehak. Maybe I'll just start by picking up where on some of the points that Sandra raised as well. I have to confess, when I was invited to speak on this, I thought to myself, why am I being asked? I don't know anything about international conflict. So as always, I start from the beginning, which is asking some key questions. And really that's what I think the starting point of all of this, what is international conflict? Who is a victim? What is empowerment? What's the time frame that we're talking about? And how do you integrate these concepts of victimization with the wider problems of conflict? Because I think these are all fundamental questions to framing the discussion itself. When we're talking about international conflict, we can think of the kind of situation in Ukraine or Syria. But there are other notions of conflict between state and non-state actors, but also you can bring in organized criminal activities and terrorist actions as well. So ISIS terrorist attacks in Europe, is that part of the concept of international conflict? And if we understand all of these different forms of armed conflict under the broad concept of international conflict, then how do those different types of actions have to be addressed when it comes to victims? And then when it comes to the victims themselves, who are we actually talking about? What we have been doing over the last years, particularly with the within the framework of international terrorism, is really talking about circles of impact and understanding that there may be direct victims at the center of this, people who have been directly present at an attack or have been directly victimized. But there's a much wider group of individuals and communities that are affected in an international conflict. There are the family members, the loved ones, the friends, there are first responders, those who care for and look after victims, witnesses who themselves may not have been directly affected by the violence that's happening, as well as local communities, and then the wider population and the collective trauma that wider population suffers. So when we're looking at victim empowerment, we need to really understand who are these victims in order to understand what is the empowerment that we need to be addressing or ensuring. And then actually we need to understand what we mean by empowerment, and this understanding that what we're trying to do is help victims to use and build their own capacity to recover and to move forward, but also build the capacity of their social support networks so that victims can act on their own choices, so that they have and are given back control over their lives, that they're listened to and recognized. And if we understand, I think, these notions of empowerment, it actually fits very closely with the way that Victim Supports Europe and across Europe, the way that we approach victims policy today and the rights of victims in actual fact, which is to start by a victim-led approach and a victims' needs-led approach. So what we're saying now is that everything that we do for victims has to be driven by their needs. And it may be based on rights, but it is driven fundamentally by their needs and an understanding of the impact of crime on victims and the challenges that they face as victims as a result of that crime. And when we look at these needs from an international conflict perspective, I think there's two parts to this. We have, the basic hierarchy of needs as set out by Maslow, and right at the start of this, there's food, shelter, safety, these fundamental requirements. We need to have those in place before we can start really looking in any substantial way around needs as associated with victimization itself. So for us in Victim Supports Europe, how we summarize these needs are in terms of respect and dignity and recognition, being recognized as a victim and being treated in a respectful manner. And then we talk about the protection of victims from further victimization, but also from secondary victimization, from the harm caused by our reactions to that crime and the way that we treat victims. And then there's a whole range of support needs, whether that's practical support, emotional, and then psychosocial support, maybe financial support, for example. Victims also need access to justice, as well as compensation and restoration, which is where the combination of justice and restoration starts bringing us towards restorative processes and transitional justice concepts as well. So I think that's really sets the foundation for looking at how we need to address the challenges faced by victims. And just going back to what Sandra was saying about there's no universal approach. This is fundamentally when we look at the needs of victims, whilst we may summarize those needs according to those 5 needs, we also have to take an individualized approach, which means understanding the personal characteristics, the history, the situation of the victim, because the way that their whole life will affect how they are impacted by a crime and what their particular needs are. But also, as Sandra said, there are these group needs. So you may be a person with a disability, you may be a person from the LGBTI community or an ethnic minority, a woman or a man, and based on some of those group characteristics, the way that you experience crime will change, but also responses to you by authorities may change as well. And that needs to be factored in when we're looking at what are the needs of the individual and what are the appropriate responses. So I think those are fundamental questions to start the examination. But when we then look at how we address these needs, we also have to establish the time frame that we're talking about, because we're talking about victims during an ongoing conflict, and we have to think about what's the location of those victims. Are they in country or are they refugees outside of the country? So if we take the current crisis in Ukraine, we and many others are acting in different ways to try to assist these victims. There are victims who are escaping the conflict who are now subject to sexual violence crimes, trafficking. We have organised criminal gangs pretending to be refugee workers or Red Cross, taking people into trafficking situations. We have crimes happening in refugee centres of different kinds, whether it's violence or fraud or other types of crimes. So what are the ways in which we can raise awareness amongst the population about the kinds of risks that they're facing? How can we help them carry out avoidance or prevention type activities so that they don't end up in those kinds of victimizing situations? There's also the people who are remaining in the country, the trauma that they're experiencing from the general conflict itself, but potentially also from war crimes. And that can be gendered, those war crimes. It could be sexual violence against women. It could be the killing of men, as we've seen in recent footage of innocent civilians. So it can be the types of crime and the situations that they're facing can be multiple. For those who are surviving, they're having to cope with complex grief issues. They're facing PTSD. And we can already be looking at how we can support those people who are still within a conflict and where the normal services may not be operational. So, for example, there have been online training activities provided to psychologists in Ukraine to help them understand better how to support the general population and how to deal with traumatizing incidents. We, for example, Victim Sports Europe, we're setting up a training on carried out by the European Network on EMDR, which is a type of therapy, to help support organisations understand better how to support people who are coming from conflict. So a lot of organisations in Europe won't necessarily be experienced in supporting victims from conflict situations. So, and there are some specific methods and approaches to be taken. So we have to think about what's happening during the conflict, but then we have to think about the post-conflict, both in the short term and the long term, in terms of the violence and victimization that they've experienced, but also these overlapping issues to do with the conflict, to do with reconstruction, schooling, and many other kinds of issues as well. And in the longer term, we're looking ultimately around how we can carry out a justice and peace process which involves victims. And I think, you know, at the heart of all of this is listening to victims and enabling those who want to participate to be able to participate. So I think that there's kind of a range of different factors that we have to think about in that empowerment process. But at the heart of it is really understanding the needs of victims, the challenges that they face, and then knowing how to incorporate those needs into your responses, which may be victim-led or it may be conflict-focused, but either way, it ends up being more or less the same kinds of responses.
Okay, thank you so much. And actually, while I was hearing you, so this sort of ties into the whole transitional justice discourse. So usually in that process, there are truth and reconciliation commissions that are set up, and they practice restorative justice practices. But do you think to some extent prosecution under criminal law, besides restorative justice processes, under criminal law, it prevents this sense of private revenge that victims have, and gives a sense of solace to the victims, because ultimately retribution does continue to, underpin criminal laws across the world. So, I mean, I was wondering if are restorative justice practices always the answer, or do the victims also want their perpetrators to be prosecuted, and that is also a mechanism of justice for them?
Yeah, I don't think there is ever any one solution fits all. And it's as much about the mechanisms you use and the experience of the victim within that process as it is the outcome itself. So, you're talking about complex social problems, and you're trying to address each individual within that complex social problem. So to believe that restorative justice alone is the answer for every victim doesn't understand the complexity of the human mind, really, and society. You need to have those options on the table. And a recent example of that is the UK government's at least initial position on the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where they were proposing to end or bring to an end any possibility of criminal prosecutions for criminal acts during the Troubles. And for a lot of victims, this was exactly this created a great sense of trauma and betrayal, because even if they haven't had any prosecutions, that knowing that there was that possibility was important to them, and having been denied that possibility for formal justice was a critical issue for them. But we also have to recognise that the justice system itself may fail victims and cause more harm. So it's as much about how that process works. So, for example, Victim Support Europe now is really trying to get governments and international bodies to understand the concept of safe justice. And by safe justice, we mean that we can't just measure our justice systems by whether we find guilty people guilty, innocent people innocent, and whether it's efficient. We also have to measure the success of justice by how we treat victims within that system. And we need to seek to minimize harm to victims when they participate within that justice system, because you can have a guilty verdict and have victims who are extremely harmed and dissatisfied. And when I first started working in this field, when I was in the European Commission developing EU victims' laws, there was a case that I relied on for part of this work, which was a young girl who was raped and was brave enough to report the crime, was brave enough to go through the trial, and saw the person who did this convicted. But 2 weeks later, she committed suicide, in large part according to her parents, because of the way she was treated within the justice system. So this idea that the formal justice alone will end a person's desire for revenge isn't necessarily true, even where you find a guilty verdict. So the question, in part, the question is, are our formal justice systems well designed to ensure that victims are heard and protected within that justice system, so that whatever the outcome, they feel broadly satisfied? And then there's the recognition that there are things and solutions that formal justice cannot achieve, which restorative justice can. And in international conflict situations, often there are many more community issues to deal with, which a justice system alone cannot resolve. But I think you have to have the two parts of it, and particularly where there are violations of human rights, or where there are crimes committed within the conflict.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Yes, Professor Sandra.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting articulation of the way in which victim support has developed and evolved, and the nuanced kind of work that particularly victim support organisations try to do. I think there are a number of things in there that are worth thinking about, though. One of which is that particularly when we're talking about conflict situations and particularly political victims, people who claim that label, is that actually victimhood is complex. The claiming to victim status under these particular circumstances might actually belie their offender status earlier on in exactly those same circumstances. So all I'm suggesting is that this dichotomous thinking that I think was flagged up for us on Sunday is actually quite problematic when you're looking to modes of intervention, particularly in post-conflict situations, because, you know, people are not either victims or offenders. You know, people are complicated. Victimhood is complicated, and whether that's at the grand level when we're talking about war and conflict, or whether we're talking about inter-community conflict, you know, if you think about kids fighting in the street, or you think about people stealing from each other's houses. Sometimes that, you know, the burglary, the stealing from each other's houses as a result of a domestic dispute, right? So people know who the offender is, and they know what happened to provoke that offence. That's back to Mendelssohn's concept of victimity, actually. So that's part of what I'm suggesting there. So victimhood is complicated. It's not either or, and that makes interventions neither simple nor straightforward. And I think I think Lev's take on this is right in terms of restorative justice. One of the problems with restorative justice initiatives is it's become such an elastic concept. It's been taken out of the context in which it was deemed to be valuable. If we go back to John Braithwaite's work and its origins in Indigenous community responses to dealing with their problems, and taken out of that context and become professionalized and become a label. So if you call something restorative justice, you get government funding to help you put initiative into practice. And the fundamental ethos of where that concept came from has been lost in translation. And I think that's why the point, you know, that Lev makes about listening to victims is really important. It's not just listening to victims, it's actually listening to people living in their communities. And in terms of what makes sense for them in relation to reconciliation. I can recall one study that was done about the transitional justice initiatives in East Timor, and the people who were interviewed as a part of that study, all they actually wanted was the bodies of their family members back so they could bury them appropriate to their own cultural, religious standards. That's all they wanted. That was their point of reconciliation. But none of the transitional justice initiatives that they'd been subjected to was taking account of that. So I think you know, the observations around justice, you know, and what that might mean, do have to be stretched beyond criminal justice, without doubt. And some of those victim-oriented responses, you know, many of us wouldn't be happy with, if, you know, provoked by revenge or, you know, punishment of difference. If we proceed as though that isn't part of what the conversation is about, then I think we are unlikely to succeed in ensuring that transitions for people who are facing problems help them move forward. Sorry, I went on a bit then. Sorry about that.
That's all right, ma'am. Anu, so that is a rather thought-provoking take on victimhood itself, and it leaves so much with us to think about. Thank you so much for that. Now I would request Professor Priyamvada to please share your views on this issue.
Yes. Thank you, Megha. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee of the first International Victimology Colloquium. My special thanks are due to your Vice Chancellor, Professor Bajpai, who has invited me to share my ideas about transnational conflicts. And as the other speakers said, I also was apprehended, like in the sense that I was hesitant to take this topic to discuss about transitional justice as well as about restorative justice. Of course, I've used these terms in a different context in some of the studies, but I have actually really not worked in this area, so I was a bit hesitant to do it. But when I prepared for this title, I've learned a lot of things about I mean, particularly about the definitions relating to transnational conflict. It's too complicated in the sense it's too broad. So there exists a discrepancy in the definition of transnational conflict itself. To explain a few. Conflict between the states and the extraterritorial non-state armed groups as one side, and I mean, it is called as the international conflicts, international armed conflicts, as well as we also have non-international armed conflicts. And not only that, we also have international armed conflict, which is influenced or which is also being called as the internationalization of non-international armed conflicts, which is the intervention by the outside state. So as far as the definitions are concerned, we are at a stake what kind of definition we have to use for transnational conflicts, because we also have direct intervention as well as indirect kind of intervention. Like direct intervention is like sending troops directly. It's a kind of war-like situation, and indirect influences which aims at like exercising the control over an armed group, or advising or kind of directing the group level of control for transformation in internationalization kind of things. So there is again a bit confusion in the definition aspect itself. And we also have different kinds of contemporary forms of armed conflicts, which includes criminal organizations that include the criminal gangs, then drug dealing gangs. And so it is really difficult for us to make a boundary, because the line of demarcation between one boundary and the another one is very meager. So it gives me lot of inputs about how to define the transnational kind of conflicts. And I thought I can just share some of the views as my previous speakers also shared some views about the armed conflict. I also thought that it's better to stick on to armed conflicts and what are the plight of victims in the armed conflict as far as the protection for victims are concerned. So, I mean, as far as the international legislations and framework for protection of victims is concerned, we have very good protection in the sense we have Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, as well as international humanitarian law, which deals with and which protects the victims. But still, even though we have a lot of protection, there are victims who do not get any kind of protection, and their dignity is lost, and there are arbitrary kind of detaining, and then there are a lot of separations from the separation of victims from their families, and especially in some of the armed conflicts, I mean they are forced to leave their homes, and they are deprived of their basic human rights as human beings, such as the essentials, the like food, shelter, etc., is denied to them. So these kind of violations, and of course we have a lot of protections, but still we have to look into the vulnerable groups also, like children, how they are affected, and women, elderly persons, and then people with disabilities, and particularly displaced people. How are we going to deal with them? And then a lot of disappearances are also happening. So how are we going to deal all these issues is a big concern. And as far as the armed conflict is concerned, the damage caused by the cost due to armed conflict is very high. For example, their livelihood is completely devastated. The houses are completely attacked, and then the places of worship, places of places like schools are targets for these kinds of attacks. I mean, in these kinds of attacks, and there are murders, ethnic cleansing is happening, then torture, rape. So these are all some of the, repeatedly we could see all these crimes and violations are very common in the conflict zones, and especially minorities in that particular zone is affected. And how are we going to particularly protect the rights of the minorities, their cultural rights of the minorities, or the religious rights of the minorities? Is there any protection to is there any what do you call, international level protection for these kind of victims who have lost their cultural identity as well as religious identity? So that's another question. And as far as the contemporary armed conflicts are concerned, especially the massive displacement of population, both within the country and within their state as well as across international borders, is a very bigger issue as far as armed conflicts are concerned. So this gives us a idea that what is required right now to because we have been watching and we've been observing what is happening in Syria as well as in Ukraine. So how much of protection we give for the victims there, and whether, there was also a question about the gender perspective relating to the protection of victims. So how are we dealing with those things? So that's also a question. Particularly the vulnerable group are really affected, like the inhuman treatment, and then summary executions, and then forced disappearances. Forced disappearances are the biggest problem here, and of course I'll a little later I'll also speak about the forced disappearances in Kashmir. And then torture, ill treatment, then lack of medical facilities, particularly the sanitary as well as nutritional facilities. Those things are a bigger issue. And policies sanctioning massive kind of arrests. There was also a discussion about the political decisions and the paralysis of judiciary and penal systems, and then lack of resources in many of the conflict zones. Then the subordination of humanitarian consideration because of the political decisions in some countries. So these are some of the issues which really needs immediate attention. And not only that, after the end of the hostilities, lakhs and lakhs of people, they still remain as political bargaining chips, and they are denied rights to release, and then repatriation of or family reunification is a very difficult task. Of course, there are agencies like central tracing agencies efforts, like ICRC's efforts to bring back the relatives, or the programs relating to family reunification is really good. But whether it is applicable or whether it is working out in all the war zones or conflict zones is a bigger question. And as far as women are concerned, the violence as well as the abuse, atrocities against women is really more in the conflict areas. And there's some of the initiatives taken by the international movement of Red Cross or Red Crescent in the war zones. And again, as I've already mentioned about the definition, discrepancy in the definition, whether some of the conflicts can be categorized under the international human rights law, whether it can come under the human rights protection, humanitarian law protection. So that's another question we have to think about. And then as far as children are concerned, again, their well-being, their development is affected, and in some of the places, there should be a mechanism to evacuate the children for safety and their for survival. So that's another aspect. As well as as far as the physical as well as mental health of the children is concerned, it's really affected. And in some cases, children are killed. Some cases, in few areas, we can witness that children are wounded, mutilated by mines, and torn from their family surroundings, and they are separated from their families. And in some cases, they are detained, imprisoned. So these are all the issues relating to children, and there is definitely immediate rehabilitation, reintegration, particularly relating to children. And the implementation of innovative programs, particularly to children, is very important. Of course, the programs, which is the existing programs, may not be sufficient for the children in some conflict zones. And I would like to just brief about a small narrative about the Kashmir incidents, because I've already mentioned about the when I was talking about the definitions relating to armed conflict. The external forces also influences the inner circle, like the armed groups in the Kashmir area. So here, if we see the statistics relating to it, according to Global Terrorism Index, India ranks the 7th among the countries most hit by these kinds of conflicts, terrorism attacks in the world. And Ministry of Home Affairs, in their report also, they state that since the emergence of the military in 1990 till 2015, there have been a total of 69,000 attacks reported, in which 13,000 civilians and 4,938 security personnel have lost their life. This is till 2015. So you can imagine the number of attacks which has taken place here, as well as the number of victims, number of people who have killed, and number of victims who are wounded. So this is really a serious problem. And not only that, the militants as well as the military who have muddled the civilian life with excessive force as well as human rights violations. This is a very serious issue here as far as Kashmir issue is concerned. Not talking here particularly about Kashmir, but since we have conducted 2 studies in Kashmir Valley relating to the victims of particularly the victims of terrorist attacks, as well as the militants, ex-militants. What is the plight of ex-militants, ex-militants as victims? What are their physical as well as mental health problems they face? So, so the reason behind using the statistics as well as referring about the Kashmir Valley is this. Since we know they have hands-on experience, we had the hands-on experience by doing 2 studies, we were able to find out the situation, how it has affected the people, the civilians, particularly in that area. As far as the statistics relating to armed conflict in Kashmir, particularly in Kashmir, is concerned, 13,478 terror incidents is reported, and 3,066 incidences are reported only from Jammu and Kashmir alone. So this shows the intensity of the situation, and not only that, the forms of violence which has taken place in Kashmir is variety of violences has taken place. Say, for example, using of explosives in buses, and then shellings. Shelling is a stone pelting shelling, and all is a very common thing there. Bomb blast, firing, explosives in government buildings, explosives against people, and of course political killings and kidnapping by families. So these are some of the serious violations happening there. And of course, burning of houses, property, how most of the property are damaged because of this armed conflict. And another issue is the enforced disappearances. So this kind of disappearances, the people from cooperating with the militants to restraint, it is a kind of deterrent effect on the people, enforced disappearances. And while browsing through the literature about the Kashmir issues, we were able to see 2,700 graves in 3 districts of Kashmir alone, 1,122 graves in Baramulla district, and 1,453 graves in Kupwara district, and in Bandipura district, 125 graves are there. So, we have collected the data from the Association of Parents and Disappeared Persons. So here, both militants as well as military, they were accused of the disappearances. Not only the armed state armed forces, but the militants are also involved in this kind of disappearances. And there is most of the graves, they're not able to identify the individuals. The reason behind why they have not, why they're not able to identify the individuals is, they say that the DNA testing, they don't have the facility to conduct DNA testing, so they could not identify whose bodies where and all these things. So So this gives us an idea that disappearances is a very big problem. And the role of media is also limited as far as the freedom of press is curtailed. So this, again, this problem also arises. So apart from that, I mean, as in other conflict zones, violence against women is also happening very high here. And they also have a concept called half widows. So half widows are called as, I mean, apart from the widows, I mean, their husband would have died in the armed conflict or whatever, but they have another concept called half widows. Here, the husband disappears, but he's not declared dead. So nobody knows what has happened to the husband. So they face the, I mean, this particular women, the half widows, they face the identity crisis. They can't inherit the property of the husband because they do not know whether he is alive or dead, or either the parents or the husband's property they could not, and they can't avail the government schemes like victim compensation scheme, or they cannot remarry. These are all some of the issues, very, very, very peculiar issues as far as Kashmir issue is concerned. So,
If I may intervene, ma'am, because I think we also have to take questions from the participants. But you rightly talked about the Indian experience and the fact that in India we don't talk about transitional justice at all. There are several states in India that have experienced prolonged conflicts, and these areas end up fostering a culture of impunity due to application of laws like armed forces, special powers, and we see this deep mistrust between state and its citizens, who fall between the cracks of the conflict and who often end up in a crossfire between security forces and these militants. Of course, we're not talking about this issue enough in India right now, but we certainly need to. So, but now because we're running out of time, I'd like to take some questions from the chat, from the participants. I think people want to understand the mechanism of transitional justice, first of all. If somebody can answer that from the panel. I think there's a question, how is transitional justice rendered? Or how are the victims of transnational crimes, how they need to be treated in war or peacetime?
I mean, maybe if I kick things off. I think the difficulty with answering the question on transitional justice is it's a very specific field. Unless you're working in it directly, I think we're all quite cautious in saying how to render it. I think if you take it from a victim perspective, there's an important element which is around the participation of the victims. And if you see, I think a good example of how this has been introduced and then taken on board elsewhere. So the ICC in its work in terms of allowing victims to be heard and protecting them within that process. And then we see those concepts have been increasingly taken on in countries, at least around Europe. So when it comes to how do we ensure victims' rights and how do we ensure that victims are part of this process of transition, you need to create a safe environment for victims to be involved. And this means ensuring that they have the support that they need. And that means having information in an easy to understand way, which is simple and accessible. So if you want your community to be part of a transitional process, they need to understand what's possible, what isn't possible, and how it should work. And they need to be part of the process of organizing those solutions. So I believe that transitional justice or any form of justice shouldn't just be done at people, but people should be part of the organization of that process. And exactly, I think as Sandra was saying, that you cannot make assumptions about what is right for a particular community. And you have to think about what are the fundamental objectives behind that from the perspective of those who will be part of that transitional process. And if the objective is really just to be able to talk to each other, or it's about recovering bodies, or it's about just hearing the truth, even if you accept that there may not be punishment attached, the starting point is to listen to victims and then act on those things that you hear. And I think that's important. If I give an example, where within the context of terrorism and the Brussels attacks in Belgium, memorials set up. So it's an important aspect of meeting the needs of victims of terrorism is to remember and to have memorials. And it's important that victims are asked what they want from such a memorial. But what happened in at least one of the memorials was that victims were asked, but then their views weren't listened to, and the government did something else, and that's even more harmful. So I think listening to victims, allowing them to be part of the process of or part of deciding how the process should operate, but you need to ensure that they are empowered in doing that by making sure that they're supported and that they are psychologically, emotionally in the right place to be able to participate. You need to take into account the differing situations and circumstances of victims, so that even the most vulnerable, even those who don't feel that they can really be there in a very present way, so that their voices can be heard as well. So having this individualized approach, which accounts for the different perspectives of those victims, is critical. Having that support framework and enabling people to voice their concerns in a safe way. I mean, those are the starting points for me in terms of how you can at least enable participation. Then when it comes to outcomes, I think you've got a whole range of other issues to cover there as well. So maybe it makes it a bit simplistic. I know that there's lots of complications when it comes to social conflict, but I think that's a starting point.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Levent. I think that's a good introduction. If anybody is interested in learning about transitional justice in detail. Yes, Professor Sandra.
Yeah, I think Lev's got that about right in terms of where you might start. I would just like to add to that what matters in that starting place is the cultural context and the historical context in which those processes can work to a greater or lesser extent. That I'm not trying to say that they can't work. I think that's just part of the ingredient that you have to take into account. I was thinking as Lev was talking actually about the Norwegian response to Anders Breivik, and the small country, small population, large number of victims. It was very, very unlikely that most people in and around Oslo didn't know somebody who'd been impacted by his attacks on individuals. Led from the top, it was about restoration. It was about putting processes back together, which is a bit like, it's kind of obviously very resonant of Niels Christie, Conflicts of Property. He was Norwegian, so you can see that those cultural values, were imbued with the response of that country at that particular point in time, led from politicians as well as from kind of understanding the nature of grassroots responses. So I think that's also part of what you start with. I would also add, my personal view is what you don't start with is some outside view of outsiders coming in and saying this is what needs to happen here. I think so I think Lev's kind of spirit of starting with in the context of understanding what went on here for the people who were concerned and what's going to help make things better, or at least recreate some sort of semblance of what there was before, because things like social conflicts, mass attacks punctuate people's lives, and you never go back to how it was. But you find a way of moving on. I think Lev's right, but I would insert that importance of context and his historical values and how different societies are at different places in relation to some of these.
Thank you so much. That was
maybe adding to that as well. It's I think setting the parameters and goals is quite helpful. I think maybe, for example, the work that Max Boone has been doing in Indonesia on peace processes, and how, you know, you're seeking a path which brings people together, and to do that, you sometimes have to get past some of the issues you can't address. So in their approach, one of the fundamental questions in terms of restorative processes with radicalized people and victims is, it's not the belief that they're trying to address, it's the willingness to use violence. So because if the discussion is a discussion about whether their beliefs are correct, you won't get anywhere. You don't get anywhere with those discussions. But if you accept different beliefs, but then you say, well, what is the behavior that's acceptable to address those beliefs, or and how do you approach that? Then I think that's an important aspect of really determining a path to solutions. You may not be able to resolve all issues within that, but then which are the ones that you can start moving forward with first? Interestingly, on the Norway response, there were so many things that worked well, but one of the things that they're struggling with now is the placement of a memorial, and there is I wouldn't call it a conflict, but there is discussion, let's say, between local residents who don't want something like that near their homes because they don't want the international attention and the reminder of the attack, versus the victims who really want something. And that's kind of that's an interesting situation where you do again have these difficult perspectives and different needs, and you have to look at how you bring those together, look at what the fundamental goals are, and see where the points of compromise might be. And part of that is understanding each other's perspectives. I suppose from a victim therapy perspective, understanding personal biases and cognitive dissonance, where you may misunderstand things and misunderstand the other person, but you may also misunderstand yourself and what your objectives are. So I think when it comes to empowering victims in this process, it helps if you really understand yourself and what you want and why you want it. And if we help victims to do that, I think that will also help within that dialogue as well.
Thank you so much. I think this was a very productive session, and I'm sure we learned, the participants learned different perspectives in transitional justice. And I think over to the organizing committee.
Okay, Mehak, before we end,
Yeah.
I do have one observation come question. This is also for Professor Walklate. So, Professor, we have so far been talking about, let's say, identification of victims, and that remains the first stage with respect to understanding of victimhood. We need to build an understanding of victimhood. We need to identify who the victims are to begin with, right? Then in the earlier sessions, we have also talked about, let's say, restorative practices and restorative justice. But somehow when it comes to transnational conflicts, I believe the problem after the issue of identification remains the process of affixation of responsibility, right? That accountability is always missing from the system, no matter where you are, which country you belong to, which conflict zone you are in, you find yourself in. That like there are always ways in which you can evade that responsibility. So my question to you, Professor, then would be one, how, like, what is the expected role from the victim when it comes to the fixation of such responsibility, and two, how do we empower them to, you know, like in a way that allows for them to be able to point out and say that, look, this is the person responsible for my victimization, or that this is the organization or nation which is responsible for my victimization?
Yes, it's a very good question. Am I still? Do you still hear me? Yes, a very good question. I'm not sure I'm fully equipped to answer such a question, but I think the question of responsibility is an important one, because it's another one of those concepts that's got lots of layers to it. Yeah. And lots of different interpretations of it. There's legal responsibility, which is perhaps the one that's easiest to grasp. But then there's if you like, personal responsibility, and then there's social responsibility. So, yeah, sometimes things happen to us because someone else is responsible. Sometimes things happen to us because we made a mistake. Sometimes things happen to us because they're a product of things that have gone on between us and others and social circumstances. So actually unwrapping responsibility and trying to actually point a finger at you were responsible for this happening to me is actually quite complicated. And I'm not so sure that it's that helpful a concept from my point of view, because it becomes another way of thinking about guilt and innocence. And I think if you take my take on what I've just said about sometimes things happen to us and we don't know why. Sometimes things happen to us because we know we've made a mistake. Sometimes things happen to us because of what's gone on between us and others. It actually, for me, takes me back to what Professor Jockler Ingram was talking about on Sunday, and that's about dignity and respect. Because at an individual level, and I think this echoes what Lev was talking about before too, at an individual level, most people, most of the time, want to be treated with respect. And if we start from that, they want to be treated with respect and they want to avoid being treated with contempt. And this is a very, very kind of traditional, almost social psychological distinction about what motivates people. So if you treat somebody with respect in the process of calling others to account, that becomes a way of empowering them to ensure that they've been listened to and heard. If you would treat them with contempt, as though they don't count, they have no value, they have no specific thing to offer in this process, that's when people get angry, and that's when people resort to other ways of calling whatever's happened to them to account. Now, the question of responsibility between nations, I've been talking very much at an individual level. The question of calling nations to account is imbued, I think, with many of the same things that we've been talking about this morning. It's imbued with history, it's imbued obviously with politics, it's imbued with face saving, to use an individual kind of term, in which the ways in which we do that have become increasingly, in the context of conflicts, dominated by lawyers, dominated by the International Criminal Court, and other sorts of initiatives. And it's my personal view that touches on such a small dimension of the process of calling a nation to account, because it individualizes what went on here. Whereas actually, when we're talking about war and conflicts, it's a collective processes that have gone on. So in a sense, the International Criminal Court just becomes symbolic, and leaves actually a lot of questions to be asked about where victims' voices actually really do fit in that process. I know that's not an answer to your question, because your question was too hard, actually.
Maybe I can just add something to it. I think it partly, when from a victim perspective, it comes down to what are they expecting from responsibility? What do they want to get from that? Because different victims have different aims. So if I go back again to the troubles in Northern Ireland, at this stage, many of the victims, that this notion of responsibility is actually about truth. They know that they're not going to get somebody going to prison, but at least finding the facts of what happened to their loved one and the circumstances could be the thing which is closest to responsibility. And then it's who is doing the recognition. So this notion of recognition. So you can have the international community holding a state or an individual to account and saying, factually, this person did it or this state did it, and we recognize that. And that in itself is a form of recognition and therefore of meeting some of the goals of responsibility, even if the actor themselves may not recognize that and may not accept it. The point that Sandra mentioned about that social recognition is really important. Even if the criminal themselves doesn't admit and take responsibility and doesn't pay the price for their crime, if society around you recognizes the harm caused and recognizes who did it, that's really important. And I think this has been part of the reason why in parts of Spain, for example, victims have suffered so much, because even despite ETA terrorists go to prison, when they come out of prison, they are celebrated by the local authorities, for example, and that's highly damaging. And then I think that there's different forms of accepting of responsibility. And Sandra mentioned about face saving, and when it comes to states, there are different ways in which states may do this, and there are different routes to achieving that. And I think of the work of Guillaume de Sanois, who set up the French Association for Victims of Terrorism, and he had direct negotiations with Gaddafi, and in the end achieved compensation payments from the Gaddafi government for the bombing of the jet which killed his I think it was his father. So that's a different form of taking responsibility, even if there isn't some sort of international sanction. So I think that's part of understanding, again, what is it that victims themselves are trying to achieve. And sometimes we're pushing for some form of responsibility, which is a state-driven thing. A state wants another state to pay, or an individual. And it's not necessarily driven by what victims want, and victims may actually want more to know what happened to their loved one, in what circumstances, etc. So I think that's an important aspect of looking at how to achieve the aims of responsibility, even if you don't term the thing that happens as being that.
Thank you so much, Professor. So with this, we come to the end of the session. I'm grateful to all the panelists and the moderator for the well-moderated, informative session. So once again, I thank Professor Sandra Wocklett, Mr. Levent Allen, and Professor Priyambada for this session. Thank you so much, everyone. I invite everyone for the closing session at 4 p.m. Please log in or stay logged in. Thank you so much.